Alors, bonjour à tous. Je rappelle le comité à l'ordre.
Good morning, everybody. We'll now begin our meeting. We have a busy day today. We have 4 experts for our study of open data. I'll present them to you right away. Mr. Eves, open data expert as an individual. Renee Miller, professor at the Department of Computer Science at the University of Toronto, and by video conference, we will also have from Waterloo University, Ginny Dubenko, Executive Director of the Stratford campus, and also by video conference from Vancouver. You'll understand that it's 5:45 in the morning over there, so we will indulge him a little. Mr. Gaylor from Microsoft Canada. So we will begin with the presentations with a maximum of 10 minutes per witness. And afterwards, members of the committee will be able to ask questions of the witnesses. So I will give Mr. Eves the floor, and thank you again for being with us this morning and for giving us your time to appear before the committee.
Just so that Mark doesn't get all the credit, I'd like to note that I also just came in from Vancouver, so it is also 5:45 in the morning for me. So good morning. My name's David Eves. For those who, just maybe a little bit of background about me, since I'm listed as being as an individual and don't have the credentials of some of my peers. I worked for the last kind of 5, 6, 7 years. I've been working to make open data happen in Canada. So I wrote the original motion that led to the creation of the open data portal in the city of Vancouver. I then worked behind the scenes with some of the provinces to help them create their open data initiatives. And I gently applied pressure on the federal government to persuade them to adopt open data as a policy. And now I also work with several governments. I ran the boot camp for the Presidential Innovation Fellows at the White House. I've worked with the State Department, the World Bank. I sit on Mr. Clement's Open Government Advisory Panel, and as well as Premier Wynn's Open Government Task Force, which recently released its results. And I sit also as an affiliate at the Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University at the Berkman Center. I'll sit on the boards of several nonprofits and as well as several startups, both in the open data space and outside. So I wanted to maybe share a few thoughts with you about what I think matters about open data and how we're doing and some of the things we could be doing. Maybe just as a little bit of a backdrop, I imagine everybody's trying to explain to you what open data is and why it matters. I think the simple metaphor I'd use is I'm carrying around with me a Fitbit, which is a small device that tracks how many steps I take every single day. This is mostly because I have the potentially bad belief that if I take 10,000 steps, I can eat whatever I want. So I try to get to 10,000. And when you look at this device, it's tracking some data about me, specifically my movement. And increasingly, as you look around, there's all sorts of data that's being tracked about you and created about you, from your bank statements, your mortgage, to where you're going. This device happens to know where that happens to be all the time as well. And it would be nice to think that you could harness all that information to tell you something useful about your life that could cause you to change your behavior or to do something different or to save a little bit of money. And I'd like to apply that metaphor to the federal government. Because right now there are probably about 1 billion of these types of devices, whether they're people tracking expenses in Excel spreadsheets or devices measuring the weather, temperature, or something else around the country, around the world. And all of that data is being collected. And wouldn't it be nice if we had access to it so that we could say something intelligent about this country and about our community and maybe change some behavior here or figure out things that are not going well? And I think the Open Data Initiative is trying to solve the same problem that many people are trying to solve in the consumer space, which is how do you harness all of this data that's being created, some of which you don't even know is it being created, you don't know where it's being created, and can you bring it into a central place where it becomes useful and actionable and leverageable by a community of people. So that kind of, hopefully that gives you a metaphor that makes it a little bit easier to understand what open data is and how potentially it can be useful. For me, there's one or two examples that I think strike me as the most interesting around how far we've come and how far we have yet to go. So I'd say, I'm sure this committee is very interested. Everyone wants to know, well, how are we doing internationally? I would argue that internationally Canada is doing relatively well. I would consider we're not a front-runner leader. We're not like the United States or the United Kingdom. But we're also not a laggard. You know, there's maybe only 20% of the countries in the world that are thinking very, very hard about open data, and we sit very comfortably in that group. The real danger that I would flag around this is I think that using international comparisons, especially this early on, and any time in government, is always enormously dangerous. I get very frustrated when I see comparisons about how government are performing in technology, and then people becoming satisfied about being at the top of those rankings. Whenever you have a ranking of government performance in technology, what you are actually doing is you're taking all the slowest movers in a space, you're putting them to one category, and then you're saying, how do we compare to all the other laggards? And then you say, well, we're really, really fast against the other slow-moving players in this space. And then we sit around and congratulate ourselves about how quick we are moving. Leadership for me is not, are you the second bull in a herd? The problem with leadership is you're in the herd to begin with. Real leadership looks like, how do you actually break away and go do something that other people are not willing to do? And whether it's within a country or internationally, the herd mentality is so strong that I think it actually prevents leadership from happening. And if you benchmark yourself against others, what you're really doing is saying, we just want to be inside the herd, and the question is, where do we rank in that herd, as opposed to really thinking what leadership and transformation could look like and doing things that could potentially really change society in a positive way. So while I think the international metrics matter, I caution you strongly to get sucked into them and somehow believe that they're a magical metric that should determine whether we're happy with our performance or not, because they're almost invariably very, very poor. The other question for me is, what's our goal? What are we trying to accomplish? When I look around, I see different players doing different things, and they have, I think, a real vision for where they want open data to take them. I think that vision is less clear in Canada. Certainly, we're not realizing our full potential. I suspect that many on this committee are most concerned with kind of the economic benefits of open data. I think those could be significant. I think there's a real risk of overplaying them, and I think there's an enormous amount of hype, and I would be very, very cautious about believing every figure that passes by you or why it is going to have an economic impact, and I'll talk about that briefly. But there's also huge opportunities around making government more transparent, which actually has economic benefits in of itself, as well as more accountable. And I wouldn't want those to be lost. And then the third is there's huge opportunities in reshaping how public servants work with one another and using open data to vastly improve the efficiency and productivity of public servants. And I wouldn't want that opportunity to be lost in the pursuit of kind of economic goals. So with that said, I think there's kind of four big ways that open data will serve to transform a society. And let me kind of highlight each one of these and what I think matters and doesn't matter about them. The first, which I'm sure you've heard endlessly about, is the opportunity around apps. I'm not the first person, and I don't want to say that apps don't matter. I think absolutely are enormously important, and there is an enormous opportunity there. But I actually feel it's also the least relevant of all the opportunities before us, especially when it comes to federal government data. A great deal of federal government data is aggregated at such a level that it becomes pretty hard to do anything particularly interesting with it. In addition, the vast majority of the data is created for policy usage, not for kind of day-to-day application usage. There are definitely data sets out there that are very, very interesting. You know, border wait times, which you heard Colin McKay talk about, I think is a great example of that. So there is operational data that's very interesting, but the vast majority of your data is actually geared towards policy analysts. And so it's geared for trying to do analysis and understanding what's going on in society or what's going on in the community. And that brings me to the second big place where I think we're going to have impact. And this is the one that I think is the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is the opportunity for open data to dramatically improve analysis and productivity. And the example I like to use is one that I think comes a little out of left field. I'm involved in something called the Canadian Boreal Forest Agreement, which is an agreement between the largest environmental groups in the country and the forestry industry, all about trying to ascertain where should logging take place in order to preserve woodland caribou and maximize the benefits for regional communities that make use of logging infrastructure. And this entire agreement is made possible because of enormous amounts of data about knowing where the woodland caribou is, about knowing where different types of trees are, and being able to layer over maps over one another to figure out where are the places where we shouldn't be logging and where are the places where we should be logging. There's no app that's going to come out of this. But if you look at the total impact that the CBFA could have on the Canadian economy, it could be in the billions. If you talk about no longer having protests against forestry companies by environmental groups, them actually supporting logging companies as they try to sell their products internationally, having a wood product that actually is seen as ecologically viable and therefore more valuable, the impact on local communities and the jobs it creates, the impact on shareholder value around all of the different logging companies, it is not hard to imagine that number very quickly running into the hundreds of millions and even the billions. And that entire project is supported by government data. And so for me, rather than focusing merely on apps, thinking about the much larger policy opportunities and the economic opportunities around analysis that open data can provide is the place where I think that particularly federal government data becomes enormously valuable and interesting. The third is the internal use of open data and the way I think it can transform how our government works. I've been around the world talking to people who run open data portals, and invariably you find that roughly 30% of the users of an open data portal come from computers that are located within the government that made that open data available. And it's not hard to understand why. It's data government creates is most useful to people who work in government. The problem is that before you had an open data portal, in order to make use of a data set, I would have to go talk to you and then your manager, and then maybe your ministry's lawyers had to get involved before they were decided I was allowed to use this data or not. And so you had 9 meetings and eating up 10 public servants 40 hours for a week just so I could get access to a data. And most of the time people were just like, forget it, I don't even want to bother anymore. And now all of a sudden, not all, but a significant amount of government data is actually available in a place where public servants can very go and quickly access it. And so all of that time spent negotiating over whether I should have access to something that is actually already a public asset has just disappeared. And so the productivity opportunities within government, I think, are quite significant.
Je vais vous demander de terminer rapidement, s'il vous plaît.
Could you briefly finish, please? Thank you.
If at this committee, and I was trying to think about how we were going to assess the value of Canada's open data policies, I'd be looking at 3 things. The first, I'd be looking at, are we thinking strategically about the policy and economic areas that we want to be driving into and what the data is that we're releasing that might support those places? The second is are we thinking hard about how government itself is using the open data it releases so that it does what we call dog fooding, which is it uses its own information rather than just kind of sharing with others and expecting them to use it, but using something completely different itself. And then the third is, are we actually sharing information about government itself? Where is the budget? Where are the things that make government transparent so that citizens themselves can better understand and make government more legible so they can become more engaged in the political process and contribute in I think, interesting ways in the policy debates. So thank you so much.
Merci pour la présentation. Donc, je vais céder maintenant.
Thank you very much. Now I'll give Ms. Miller the floor, and she's from the University of Toronto.
I thank the members of the committee for inviting me to participate on this important panel. I'm a computer scientist researcher, and I study the problems and the opportunities that open data presents to the science of computers. And in particular, I study the problem of data curation, which can briefly be defined as ensuring that data maintains its value over its lifetime. So ensuring that there's still value in that data and that that value can be used by humans. So I have 3 points that I'd like to present, and I'm going to try to reduce the geek level. I realize I am used to talking to computer science students, so please let me know if you don't understand anything I'm saying here. So I have 3 points that I think can help Canada kind of become a leader in the open data revolution. And my first point is that I think the open data portal should adopt the principles of open linked data. So when we put a file up on the web, we are using technology that's been around for 20 years, or even more than 20 years. Since the beginning of the web, we've been able to share data in files over the web. And the state of the art in data sharing is not just sharing files, these static, inanimate files. The state of the art when we share data, and by we I mean scientists like myself, academics, but also industry leaders. When we share data that's linked. And what that means is that the objects that we're referring to in the data sets are dereferenceable. It's a fancy geek term for meaning I can click on it. When I click on it, I get important and interesting information about that object. And among that important and interesting information, I get relationships to other objects and important information about them. So let me give you a concrete example of that. So the most downloaded file from the Open Data Portal in February 2014 was a file about charities. And it's a static file. It just has strings and it has numbers in it. So it has strings naming different charities and it has facts about those charities. But it's just a dead file. What I would like is when I download that file, that when I see, say, the Rideau Street Soup Kitchen, I would like to be able to click on that link, get important information about the soup kitchen. For example, I'd like to get important information of where it's located, what community it serves, how many people it serves. Some of the facts, some of the data, how much federal money it gets is in that file. But other information, like does it get provincial funding, does it get private funding, who are those private funding agencies and what's the information about them, that's not there. But it's very easy to provide in using today's technology to make the data linkable and to use the principles of open link data to enrich this data. So that's my first point, is to embrace the principles of open link data. My second point, which is highly related, is that open data is about information flow, and that information flow can't be unidirectional. If the flow of information is solely from the government to the public, then there's no incentives for people to do interesting and creative things with that data. So if we just make the data available, if we take a data file and throw it over the transom, close our eyes and hope somebody's going to do something interesting with it, we're not creating the incentives to get people involved, to change lives with the data, to solve problems, to improve government, to spur the economy. And I think worse, it has the potential of creating this adversarial relationship. It has it gives the perception that the government's in control of the data and it's just handing it out. And there's no ownership or investment in the data itself. So I think open data is fundamentally about creating participatory opportunities where people can become invested in that data and are incentivized to contribute to the data itself. And incentivized to improve the data and to create new innovative ways of using the data. And I think this investment creates trust, and people will trust the data if they can contribute to the data. And it also provides an information flow back into government, and David was speaking to this as well, where the information itself is flowing back into the government and improving government decision making based on better data. And my third point is that opening up data is important, but it's equally important to create and curate participatory opportunities with this data. And so these are not just apathons. I think they are other ways in which the community can get involved in doing analysis over this data and improving this data. And through these, I know that the Open Data Portal is already deeply involved in this. They have the Great Canadian Apathon, which is in its 4th year. It was just at University of Toronto. So we're already doing quite a bit along these lines. But I think there are two important outcomes of this, that these activities are not just educational. You're not just teaching students how to use data. Rather, you're looking to find those visionary students, or I call them students, everybody younger than me is a student, those visionary people who want to create new entrepreneurship opportunities with that data. And I think that using open government data is an absolutely terrific way of getting those folks to stay in Canada. Too many of my entrepreneurial students go to Silicon Valley because that's where the air is filled with startup culture, and you can walk into a startup and somebody will be there to help you with your startup. That kind of startup culture just doesn't exist here in Canada. But if we have more people using community data, open government data in their startups and building things around that, there is an incentive for them to stay within Canada. But also, in addition to these visionaries who are going to spur our economy, I would encourage you to look to activate the power of the crowd. And by that I mean creating data sets where the community itself can contribute to those data sets. And these are things like allowing the community to comment on the number of open beds in homeless shelters and activities like this where the community gets involved in improving the data and gets invested in the data itself. And the power of the crowd can be really important in leveraging government open data. And so in conclusion, I'm absolutely thrilled to see this initiative in Canada. I think it is a tremendous opportunity here, and that Canada has potential to become a leader in open data, in the open data revolution, and I look forward to seeing much more in this vein.
Merci. Thank you for your...
Thank you very much.
Alors, on va aller vers Monsieur...
And now we will move on to Mr. Gaylor Redwave by video conference from Vancouver. You have 10 minutes, Mr. Gaylor.
Hello, and thank you, everybody, for inviting me. Thank you to the committee for inviting me to participate this morning. It's bright and early in Vancouver. So my name is Mark Gaylor. I work for Microsoft Canada. I've been working with Microsoft for over 10 years. And I'm a technology strategist for Microsoft Canada. I work primarily with municipalities. And as part of that role, I'm a subject matter expert on open data and open source technologies. So I'd like to comment on a few things. First of all, I very much appreciate the comments by my colleagues, David and Ms. Miller, just previously. And one of the things that I have experience with is working with different governments around the world. So I've been engaged with open data projects both in Canada but also in the USA, Colombia, Japan, Central and Eastern Europe, and the UK. So I'd like to make some comparisons. Even I totally and fully agree with David's comment earlier on that it's dangerous to make comparisons in terms of a league table, but I think there are some insights that we can gain from what other countries are doing compared with what Canada, how open data has evolved with Canada today. So I'd like to start there, and then I'd like to pick up on a couple of other points that my colleagues have raised already. I think what's interesting about when you look at the way open data is evolving around the world, it's evolving in different ways based on the way that government agencies have chosen to engage it. So, for example, in the UK and the US, we see a very top-down approach where the UK and US governments at the very top levels of government have sponsored open data initiatives, and they're driving adoption of open data throughout government departments and government agencies, and we see this top-down approach as it flows downwards through the government infrastructure. I would say in Canada what we've seen is more of a bottom-up approach to open data. So we've seen it in early days. It was adopted primarily by the cities, and then the provinces kind of caught up. You know, in Vancouver, I think Vancouver started in April 2009. We've seen, other cities adopt open data initiatives, and then the provinces have come in, and I think the federal government has come in after some of these other cities and smaller agencies have already adopted open data initiatives. So that kind of explains why we see different countries and different initiatives at different stages of evolution to a certain degree. In the UK and US, I would say that open data initiatives across government are fairly mature and fairly consistent in the way open data is thought of. And again, I would say in Canada we see it in open data being adopted in different ways at different levels of government jurisdiction. The second point I'd like to make around that is that as we look around the world, it's important to understand that open data itself is not an endpoint. Open data is a transition to something else. It's an enabler for other things to happen. It's an enabler for things such as economic stimulus, as we've discussed, and I'm sure we'll discuss more on that in the session. It's an enabler particularly for citizen engagement, getting citizens actively involved and participating in the business of government. And I think it also represents a cultural change internally for government and government agencies. When I've been around the world talking to national and provincial and state governments about their open data initiatives and the way that we can use open data to engage citizens, particularly those parts of citizenry that we may not already be engaged with, a big comment I get at the end of my engagement with that particular government is, well, this is great, but actually now that we have this capability to share data and to collaborate, we want to do that internally as much as we want to do that externally. And I think that point was made very well by my colleagues previously. So I think what's important for the Canadian government, or the opportunity for the Canadian government here, is to provide guidance, is to provide a framework to take the open data initiatives that already exist, to create opportunities to share more open data, to engage citizens and third parties, to encourage them to share this data and use this data, to enable that data to be shared in a way that can easily be consumed by any of the parties, any of the actors in the ecosystem. So be it a data scientist, be it a researcher, be it a citizen, be it an application developer, be it a student. But I think it's very important that we understand this is a cultural change that will lead to other positive benefits. This is not just about sharing data itself. And so it's important that we have, that the government provides a framework where to encourage parties to collaborate around the sharing and reuse of open data, so private-public partnerships, for example, and particularly to engage those parts of citizenry that perhaps we're not already engaged with and get them actively involved in the business of government. Let me give you a very simple example. 2 weeks ago, we ran a teen hackathon in the city of Surrey. So the city of Surrey sharing its open data. They have an open data portal. And they invited teens, so young people from the ages of 13 to 19, to participate in this hackathon. And for half a day, we worked with them with technology. We showed them how to produce applications. And what was interesting at the end of that is we asked for feedback and ideas. And it was amazing to see these teenagers come up with ideas about how to use transit data to better navigate through the city, how to use weather data to better understand when weather might affect particular tourist spots or landmarks. And you could just look at that initially and say, well, okay, these are interesting ideas, but will they ever come to any kind of fruition? But what's really interesting about the whole thing was the fact that the city it's stimulating students and young people to think about engaging the city in ways that had not previously been possible. These were young people that were thinking about actively working with the city, visitors to the city, citizens of the city, and getting them excited and engaged in looking at ways at how to improve city services, both for visitors and for folks that already live in the city. So this is quite transformational, and I think this is a very simple example of the transformational cultural change that can be brought about by sharing open data. Another example I will give you from a cultural aspect is when I was engaged with the government of Colombia. I was invited down there to provide some guidance to them about the way that they would share data with their citizens. And I said that when I went down there, I said I was surprised that the government of Colombia was thinking about sharing open data, because they're not known, as an external person, they're not known for their openness or the way that they may engage the citizens in a transparent way, and that may be considered to be a threat to the government. And they said this was the entire reason for them doing it. So whereas we look around other governments and they say, well, we're doing this for economic stimulus, or we're doing this for better engagement with certain parts of society, in Colombia they're doing it deliberately to show that they're being open and transparent, and this is part of their cultural change with their citizens. The last point I'd like to make is I think that the opportunity in Canada is huge for Canada to be a leader in this area. even though we look around the world and see different things, open data initiatives evolving in different ways, we have a long way to go with open data, to David's point earlier on. There's much more that can be done. There's much more transformational benefit that can arise out of open data, but I think that the government can help, and the government can stimulate this by providing guidance, frameworks to work, particularly in public and private partnerships, guidance in the sharing and openness of data, and also providing ideas and guidance around the sustainability of open data and how that can be part of the ongoing business of government and citizen engagement, rather it just being seen as an end to itself. Thank you very much.
Merci à vous pour la présentation.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We will now move on to our last witness, last but not least, Ms. Dibenko from the University of Waterloo, Kitchener in Ontario.
C'est à vous.
You have the floor.
Thanks very much. Can you all hear me?
Oui.
Great. Great remarks already, and had taken a lot of the points that I was going to make. I would start off by saying that over the past 20 years, we've seen an awful lot of innovation, creativity, disruption, and today we don't know exactly where open data will lead, but we do know that it will be very transformative. Some ways of doing business will start, some will evolve, and learning how to navigate, that will be the challenge that lies ahead for us. But the potential that certainly we saw in the very early days of the web, and I lived through all of that, is what I see now with open data. Open data, I believe, is data with a mission. It'll create jobs, it'll fuel startups, launch new industries with revenue purportedly in the billions. However, every day, untold numbers of people try one more time to figure out Facebook's privacy settings and wonder exactly what Facebook knows about them anyway. And most people have only one concern about their personal data, and that is they want to keep as much of it as they can as private as possible. So there is a central paradox here. Releasing personal data as open data can definitely benefit society and ultimately help the individual. But if the data is not controlled carefully, having it out in the open will damage individual privacy and may outweigh the benefit and slow the process down. I was introduced as the executive director of University of Waterloo's New Stratford campus, focusing on digital media. Additionally, I have had an extensive background in technology in corporate Canada, with 30 years in Bell Canada in IT and digital communications. And I am currently a member of the Board of Governors for SSHRC, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. So you can understand that I have a number of viewpoints on the open data opportunity. I'd like to begin with the viewpoint of our wonderful young digital natives enrolled in our undergraduate and graduate programs at the University of Waterloo. Digital natives, these are young people who have born in 1997, who have literally never had a device, not had a device in their hands. And like Mark referred, we have engaged them on a number of occasions with the municipality. We recently ran a project for Stratford around garbage, of all things. And it was a hackathon run over a weekend. And the outcome, essentially, when do you put your garbage out and how do we communicate with our citizens? We didn't think that our young students would be particularly interested in this. They dove in and produced some remarkable methods of connectivity that the city is now looking to continue to develop. But that pales in comparison with Code 2014, run by Tony Clement, a hackathon that was run across Canada about a month ago, engaging 900 young people in challenged them to develop apps around the open data that the Canadian government already has laid out. I am delighted to tell you that of the 900 applicants or participants, a team from our school actually won, and their application essentially delved into StatsCan, employment and social development Canada data, the Canadian Revenue, and CMHC in helping immigrants choose the right place to come when coming into Canada. It was actually featured on the CBC this morning. There are a number of other kinds of applications that were developed as well. 15 were actually finalized. But Mark, I loved what you said. From my point of view, what we're really doing here is engaging young people in the affairs of the government, and that's been a huge challenge, I think, certainly in municipal and provincial government levels. So the expectations of these digital natives, as a consumer, they definitely want the personalization of their experience, which comes from open data, but they also want to ensure that their data is very private, or they have control over that. As an entrepreneur, they want ready access to the data, but they also want assurances of ownership once they've developed their idea. At a corporate level, I think a storm is brewing. Corporations want access to personal data, unattributed, to examine trends by demographic group, for example. But they also want attributed data to do specialized or specific targeted marketing, which is scaring a lot of people. The opportunity examples that McKinsey have certainly pointed to look to billions, $300 billion annually in healthcare in the U.S. alone. They go throughout the world, and the opportunities are really limitless, as David referred to earlier. So finally, I do believe that the Canadian government is at the leading edge of governments around the world. Certainly, we are seen as leaders and regularly referenced, particularly in U.S. documents on the topic. I think we're well positioned for significant savings. The granting agencies, the Tri-Council, conducted extensive consultations around big data's role in the development of digital scholarship in Canada. That was conducted in the fall of last year, coining the term open research. The conclusions were threefold. First, that there's a culture of stewardship which asks for an establishment of clear policy for data sharing. Second, that there is a coordination of stakeholder engagement, in other words, long-term planning. And remember that this isn't about data on colliding particles, but mostly data on people. And therefore, the involvement, I think, of SSHRC is very important. And thirdly, they raised as an issue the developing capacity, so that engages funding, roles and responsibility amongst national, provincial, and institutional stakeholders. So in conclusion, I'd just like to say that I believe that open data is really our next natural resource. Canada has the digital infrastructure. We have the reputation for collaborative management. We have the respect of many in the world in this arena, and we have a hugely developing knowledge worker population through programs such as ours in Stratford. I think Canada should make open data a priority, establishing policies, engaging in long-term planning, and developing capacity. Thank you.
merci à vous, merci aux quatre aussi pour leur présentation.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the witnesses for their presentations. And as I mentioned earlier, there will now be a question and answer session between the members of the committee and the witnesses. And perhaps if you could ask your questions of a specific witness, that would make things easier, especially because we have two by video conference. We'll start with Mr. Blanchet for 7 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. This topic today is very interesting. You all talked about it in a different way from a different perspective. I would like to have, well, perhaps there wasn't enough time for this, but I would like to get the context, the real context for this open data, that is, transforming our society into a digital one. Whether we like it or not, the Internet has brought a lot to our society. It's almost a right to have access to it. We have access to Internet almost in the same way as we have access to running water. And open data is part of that context. There are already some things that were mentioned on this. And you can see it on sites like Facebook and Amazon, for example. There's also personalization happening, individualization, for users and consumers. I would like to start with Mr. Gaylor. I found your approach very interesting because you talked a lot about the different approaches and of the context for open data. The Americans started at the federal level, if I understood your presentation correctly. And for us, it was a little bit more heterogeneous. What I'd like to know is, did you look at how this was done outside of North America, and what are the other trends that are present? Do you also know what's happening in other parts of the world, so that we, as representatives of the Canadian government, we can have a good idea of what's happening at the international level?
Yes, thank you for the question. So, first of all, I can only obviously comment on the jurisdictions where I have personal experience. But so I would say a couple of things. I think where we see, so if I back up a little bit and just kind of re-clarify what I said earlier on. I think where we see a top-down approach, say, such as in the UK and the US, and what we mean by a top-down approach in open data terms is where guidance is given by the national government in ways that data can be shared, how departments can share that data, what the guidance and framework, they provide guidance and frameworks to enable that to happen as part of the business of government. So that's what we mean by that top-down approach. What we tend to see is that the way, obviously, what we tend to see is that governmental departments then become more encouraged to share data because they've been given a mandate by the national government, if you like, and it becomes more baked into the process of government rather than being seen, well, we do government, oh, and we also do open data. And I think there's some good learning there for Canada, certainly. Canada is in a position where it can certainly exploit some of this learning that we see in, say, the UK and the US. But that's not exclusive to other countries. So if we look at, say, such as countries such as the Germanic countries, for example, Austria, Germany, Switzerland, again, what we see there is that this is very much city-based. The national governments are looking at open data initiatives, they're looking at open data policy, but by and large, to date, the way that the citizens have engaged on open data is through city and provincial open data initiatives. I would say the same for Italy, for example. If we look at some work that's been done with the Italian Ministry of Health to share data, if we look at the initiatives that are going on throughout Italy, they are largely city and provincial based. And there is a reason for this. if you think about data, the value of data and its relevance to citizens, national data, of course, is interesting. Statistical information, of course, is interesting. It's particularly interesting to data researchers and data scientists. However, if you look at the average citizen, they're interested to know, how do I, when is my garbage available? What is the health situation in my local school area, for example? So local data has a lot more relevance to the average citizen in many cases than, say, national trending data, and that's why we see these initiatives evolving in different ways, and citizens engaging and taking up that data in different ways.
Merci.
I hope that was answered.
Merci, Mr. Gaylor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gaylor. And so your time is up. So we'll move on. 5 minutes.
With our panel of witnesses this morning, we started this initiative a few weeks ago, and it was recognizing that as a federal government, we've signed a G8 Open Data Charter, and there's really a mandate now to kind of develop a roadmap for the federal government, and I appreciate the different perspectives. First question is around, and I'd like to actually get some input from all four of our witnesses this morning, but it's this notion of the government as a publisher of data, very much a one-way flow of information from government to citizens, versus the notion of the federal government being more a facilitator or creating the public square where people can publish certain data, a way to engage them. And there's many examples that come to mind where the government can't actually create the data. If you think about species at risk, for example, where there's eyes and ears all over the country and people might be able to spot a rare bird and they can provide that information. One of the challenges with providing that public square is how do you confirm whether the data is good data, or do you need to confirm? I mean, there could be some people who are there not so much just to publish data, but they have a certain point of view they're trying to advocate, and they could hijack that public square. Can each of you in turn, and maybe just in the order that everybody spoke, just talk about that 1.0 version of open data versus a 2.0, more of an engaged version of public data?
Absolutely. I agree there's opportunity there, but I would be, for the reasons you mentioned, I'd be fairly conservative about how I would try to engage in that opportunity. One of the things that the government has done that I think has been quite effective has been a canonical source for data that is highly trusted. I mean, Statistics Canada creates data that is highly trusted by people in the nonprofit, the for-profit, and government space. And actually having something where people can all point to a data set and say, we believe that, and we use that as the foundation for a conversation is enormously useful and cannot be underestimated. So to kind of talk about how you crowdsource the creation of data creates an enormous number of methodological problems that I would be wary of rushing into, especially when we have so much data that actually is canonical and that is verifiable that we still already are not sharing, and I would argue are not leveraging as effective as we could. I'd much rather solve that initial problem first before thinking too much about that second problem.
Okay, and Ms. Miller?
Let me give you an example of where this has worked. In the U.S., they have a portal. I forget the exact name, but it's something like Peer Patent Database, where they have opened up the patent process to input from experts, and recognizing that the expert on a particular patent topic is often not in the government itself. And so they invite scientists, they invite inventors to comment on patents that are under review, and they have found that they get much higher quality information from that process than they could just adjudicating the patents themselves using their own experts. And so they didn't abdicate the responsibility for making the final decision, for having somebody making sure that there wasn't somebody with a bias inputting data, but they were able to get much richer information on which to make their decisions. Okay. So I think that you can walk that line. I think you do have to be careful with it and still have somebody adjudicating the information itself. Okay,
so. And maybe Mr. Gaylor and Ms. DeBenko, if you could comment briefly on that. It's in the sense that one of our objectives of this study is to give our own government, the Treasury Board specifically, that direction on how to create that roadmap for the federal government.
Well, I think one thing that's very important to understand with this topic is that all data is inaccurate to a certain level. So you can't wait till the data is 100% accurate to share it. And that's something that some government departments feel very concerned about. So again, I agree with David's point. I think the emphasis here is on sharing data that's not being shared today, and setting an expectation for the integrity and accuracy of that data as it goes out either to public or to commercial entities for that matter. So I think as long as you're clear about what that might be, I think that's I think that would be where I would place the emphasis first.
And I would finally just say that if your eventual goal is engagement, then there is nothing like asking someone to contribute to the dialogue in a real way, to really engage the individual constituents. So the accuracy aside, I think it's a process that's well worth pursuing.
Thank you, Monsieur Trottier. Maintenant, Madame Day pour 5 minutes.
Thank you. And now let's move on to Ms. Day for 5 minutes. Thank you. My questions will be mostly for Mr. Eves and Ms. Miller. The study is to improve government practices on open data, but really for this, we want to study how Canadian businesses and others can really look at ways to use open data for better economic purposes. So that's really the goal here. From an economic perspective, how can we use open data? Mr. Eves, you talked about linked data, for example, on caribou and the potential for the forestry industry. We did hear some questions about that from a previous witness, and I find it very interesting. Earlier, I used my iPad and went to look at taxes. And I looked at our Canadian data for income tax, and we're 13th in the world, and Revenu Québec is 4th. And a previous witness stated before Treasury Board, I believe, or from Treasury Board, that we are in a good position in terms of open data among the G8. But I'm still skeptical about this. So how can we make data more accessible? Why would people come to our website, sitegc.ca, instead of going and using a search tool? How can we ensure that data is used? Because there will be all kinds of data available, whether it is for research and development and universities or others. How can we be leaders in the world? We say we are, but are we really? Well, I'm going to speak in English because it's very hard for me to get the nuances right in French.
There's a few things I would say. The first thing I'd say is I think we have to look at some timelines here that are going to matter. I love the point about students using open data in their research. Prior to the release of the Open Data Portal, you had to pay for StatsCan data. That meant every single student in this country who was doing a paper in undergrad or doing research, they all used American data to do all of their work. All their case studies were American-based because the American data was free. So up until 3 years ago, everybody in Canada who did any kind of studies in university tended to gravitate towards American data. So some of the economic benefits are going to come from having a population that becomes more and more familiar with Canadian data and what's available. And that's going to take us a process of several years to have students who are going through college and in their studies beginning to familiarize themselves with what's possible and what's available, and then entering the workforce and bringing those to the companies that they have. So I do want us to make sure we have some expectations about how long some of the transformation will take. That'd be the first piece. The second is, I think, to have a really strategic vision about what are the industries that we want to support, that we have data around, and what are the policy goals that we think that we can pursue that would enhance those industries. One of the things that we do know is that data in of itself, even when it almost never gets used, can have a transformative impact on how industry operates. One of the best examples of this was the release of the TRA, which is the pollution data in the United States. In Canada, we have something familiar called the NPRI data. This is the data that every facility in the country must release about how much pollution it released. And the very release of that, the creation of that data set, caused a huge number of facilities in the United States to lower the amount of pollution that they were releasing. So they became more efficient and more environmentally sensitive, just because they now knew that everybody in the world could come and look at what they were releasing. So as a government, it would be interesting for us to think about what is the data that if we knew we had, it would enable us to enable our economy to become more productive and more effective. And then we had a pursuit around how do we gather that data, and then how do we share it in a way that industry can leverage or community groups can leverage. And in fact, there was an article about this just this morning where there was enormous concern about a potential housing bubble in Canada. And at the end of the day, the chief economist at the CIBC, or the lead economist on this issue at the CIBC, said, we don't actually gather data that would allow us to assess whether or not there is a bubble. So if we're looking at the kind of various industries that are out there and where the deficiencies on data are, economists and industry experts, people in industry, they're already telling us where we're deficient. I think the question we need to be asking ourselves is, what role does government have in creating those data sets and curating them to help the economy reach its maximum potential?
Merci. Thank you, Madame Day. Now to Mr. Aspin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome. So obviously we have a wealth of information to help us with our study, and welcome to our witnesses. I was rather intrigued, David, with your analogy of the bulls. I like that analogy, whether you're in the pack or you're the leader. And perhaps I could get a comment from each of you with regard to if we want to assume a leadership role in Canada in this data argument. What is the number one factor that we should pursue? Maybe I could get a priority from each of you. And in fact, if we should be the leader at all, maybe we'll start with you, David.
I was really hoping we were going to go in reverse order for once. I don't know if this takes us to that kind of takes us out of the pack, but what I think is this is going to be boring and technical, but the leadership thing in my mind is the danger that we have with open data right now is that it's this kind of thing that we're tacking on at the end of the process, where you have a government that creates data, it analyzes, it does interesting things, and at the very end we tack this thing on the box and, oh, by the way, you have to make it public with the rest of the world. And so as a result, our open data initiative is a compliance problem. It's something ministries do. It's kind of like access information. They don't really want to be doing it. They've got to be doing it. The government's asked. But it doesn't actually support a business need right now at the ministry. And my argument would be that if you want to be a genuine leader and you want to be thinking about what a government looks like in the 21st century, is you've got to stop thinking about the data as being an end product that sits at the top, at the end of the process, but rather as being core infrastructure for running government and as the platform upon which all good decisions and all government rests on. And so when I talk about kind of that term dog fooding, which is, you use your own materials, like, you don't just publish data and say, oh, we hope other people are going to use it. You dog food it. It's like you create it and then you build your own infrastructure on top of that. And if we expect industry to be using government data, they're only going to start using it and really believing that we're committed to it when we're using it as well and we build our own infrastructure on it. So the number one thing I would do is go from here to there.
Okay. Renee?
Yeah, well, and responding to both questions, too, I think we shouldn't worry that the government data is not necessarily the one that's returned in search engines and so forth. I think what we should do is understand to what extent government data has been taken up by researchers, by industry, and made into more high-quality data. And so David alluded to the fact that most researchers in Canada use data.gov data to do their research, and I can attest to that. My graduate students use data.gov data to do their research. But we republish it as richer data using what we have done, and because we've gone in there and found data that's interesting to us. And I think in terms of that information flow, we have to both understand what data has been taken up by the community and use that to motivate what additional data that we provide through the open data portal. And so we use the expertise of the crowd to come back and say, well, actually, we can improve the data that we're putting out there to better spur economic growth.
Thank you. Mark?
So one of the areas that I would focus on is data that's locked in siloed government data stores. And I'll give you a very simple example. I was working with the government of Slovenia, and I met with their Bureau of Statistics, and one of the challenges they had is, I don't know if anybody here has worked with statistical data, but government statistical data is often locked inside very specific, very narrow and niche statistics systems, and made available in very strange and even from a technology point of view, almost impenetrable data formats. What was interesting is that the Slovenian Bureau of Statistics were very familiar with the Canadian Bureau of Statistics. So from one statistics bureau to another, they had a relationship and they were familiar with each other's work. However, from a broad citizen perspective, citizens couldn't really easily get access to this data. And I think this point was made before. A lot of the data that's locked in some of those siloed government data stores is really rich, valuable data for citizens, analysts, researchers, even private entities. So I think it's worth looking at how we get that data out of locked systems and make it more available to end users, citizens, and consumers using common tools and access methods that they have today.
As pointed to in the SSHRC consultation document produced October last year, I believe that we would benefit hugely in Canada from developing a more forward-looking digital research environment, and specifically it calls for the development of a coordinated plan to establish and operate a number of world-class centers specializing in data management. And indeed, I think there was $3 million already targeted toward the Open Data Institute in Waterloo at last budget.
Merci pour vos réponses.
Thank you for these answers. And now, Mr. Byrne.
Much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for giving us a really excellent presentation and perspective on this. I want to get some feedback on the reconciliation of data integrity within an open data environment. You know, I think some of the perspective here is that that there is a single portal, a single channel, and a single standard of the integrity of the data, so that when you plug into the portal, you are getting a set of data which has been tested and you know to be authentic, and someone is accountable for that, for the integrity of that data. Renee, in your presentation, you included aspects of, let's have a discussion about how many beds are available at a homeless shelter. That almost seems more of a blog. If you don't have, if there isn't credibility and authenticity of the data, if it's not tested and someone is not accountable to the data, I mean, there will always, undoubtedly, there will be mistakes, no matter what standard you create. But there has to be a relatively highly certifiable standard for inclusion into an open data project. Otherwise, it could be just termed a blog. Could I get some perspective on that notion of the single channel, the single data integrity concept? And whether or not that's, because governments have one perspective on all of this. They are accountable, or at least they have the capacity to be accountable. A group of organizations, community-based organizations with limited funds in a municipal environment has a lesser standard, I think it's fair to say. Just a little bit of perspective on that.
Sure. I would take the example of Wikipedia. So from a broad community with a broad set of expertise, you can come down to find good, high-quality information. Is everything in Wikipedia true? Absolutely not. And so when you're using the power of the crowd and the opinions, the aggregate opinions of the crowd, I think there are certain things that you can use it for, and for allocating in real time resources where you see the resources should go. I think that's a good use for that information. I think if you're trying to do longitudinal studies, you probably need some oversight over the meaning of the data and some curation over that data itself. So I think we shouldn't, though, dismiss community-provided data just because it's not curated and may not have that same level of integrity, because it can still provide incredibly valuable information for people, particularly for public workers, kind of on the ground, because it can give them a sense of the signal of where their resources, their information should go. And that's very different than a historian kind of trying to actually pin down exactly what happened.
Okay.
So I think we have to weigh the differences there.
David?
Yeah.
And I would like to go to our teleconference as well. So just
I'll try to be brief. I mean, I agree with you. I actually think there needs to be accountability, especially around data sets that government's using to make decisions. I am interested in crowdsourcing. But I think that there are incredible limits around how to do that. I mean, even the example, the peer-to-patent's a wonderful example, and there are very, very tight constraints around what makes it work, which is it's very easy. You want to be using crowdsourcing. It's very good to be using crowdsourcing to disprove things, right? So you're identifying places where something is actually not true, right? So we're identifying patents that are not valid. It's also great to identify data sets that are in error. It's much harder to use it to identify what is actually truthful or what is actually a fact. So, so one of the nice things, we should be treating our open data portals as an engagement tool because they're actually a wonderful way to crowdsource errors. Not because we want to find and make people accountable, because there are always going to be errors in the data. So let's actually surface them more quickly so that we can then get to better quality data faster so that governments make better decisions with more reliable data sets.
Chair, if we could go to Jeannie and Mark?
Ouais, il reste environ, je pourrais donner 1 minute.
I can give you 1 minute each for answers.
Sure. The comment that I was going to make on that is that if you're first of all, it's important that you have attribution. Who is accountable for curating a particular data set? I think that's very, very key here. The second thing I would say is it's very important to have an agreed feedback loop where if you do make the data, if you do choose to crowdsource the accuracy of the data, and you do invite third parties to participate in that, it's important you have a feedback loop that enables them to do it effectively, that people see that the data gets updated within that authority, the authoritative source of that data, and that the data is then, the more accurate data is then reflected on a timely basis. I think if you have that feedback loop, you then give people confidence that this is a real thing and that it's a sustainable thing and that the quality of the data is improving over time. It's not something that you can do as kind of a one-off or let's try it and see. I think you have to have that feedback loop and sustainability effort on top of it.
Mark said it perfectly. I have nothing to add.
Merci. Donc.
Thank you. So let's continue with Ms. Ablonzi for 5 minutes, please.
We wish we had a day with each of you because this is a very rich discussion. As you know, this is part of a G8 initiative, and there's been commitment by a number of countries to move in the direction that we're talking about. So I'd like to, for each of you to focus on the internationalization or the collaboration, global collaboration of the Open Data Initiative. And although Canada may or may not be a leader, there is a mastermind principle that we want to tap into where we share best practices, where we learn from others. And so I'd be interested in your observations on how Canada can improve its collaboration on the Open Data Initiative and where we should put the most focus with our partners. Okay, Mark, why don't you start?
So I guess I think one of the things that I would point to is, in his way of responding to this question, is we're starting to see some interesting relationships outside of the traditional, say, government-industry relationship pattern, particularly around open data. So one example that I would give you here is how the World Bank is starting to allocate some of its investment and stimulus funding. It now requires countries, nation states that it's working with to have an open data policy and to be able to provide evidence that they are being more transparent with their use of data and providing data services to citizens. So I think if we look at, and that's happening sort of globally, I think if we look at that as an example, I think Canada can learn from these examples and establish or encourage similar relationships between government and industry participants, because the more you join these collaborations together, the more participants you get working together, the richer the data becomes, and I think the more powerful the impact the data has in the community.
Jenny?
I talked a little bit earlier about establishing roles and processes, and that's hopefully one of the underpinnings to the ODI. But once you have processes and roles established, then sharing with more international participants is facilitated.
So I have kind of three pieces of advice this way. I'm really glad you raised the G8 because there's some things going on there I think that are quite interesting. The first thing I would say is, at a very tactical level, I actually worry about some of the ways we might be slipping around our G8 commitments. In fact, I was very disturbed to realize 2 months ago that Industry Canada, which shares a database of corporate entities in Canada, used to share actually who were the directors of those corporate entities. And now the list of who those directors are now goes behind a $5 paywall. So rather than just being able to see who are the corporate directors, you now have to pay $5 per company to see who the directors are, which actually runs contrary to the spirit of the G8 agreement, which was to make corporate data more transparent to the public. And in fact, if you wanted to spot global corruption or tax evasion or problems at a corporate level, having a corporate database that is downloadable and accessible is critical to doing that, and the G8 agreed to that, and yet we've actually gone in the opposite direction. So from a tactical place, I would encourage this committee to be looking very closely at Industry Canada's move to understand why they made this choice. The second thing I would say is there is an opportunity, looking at something like corporate data. The opportunity exists in how do we harmonize this data across jurisdictions. So the question would be, places where we think that there's policy importance, so corporate transparency, for example, how do we harmonize how we release the data with how the UK releases the data, with how the United States releases the data? Because this would make analysis across jurisdictions much easier. So spotting things like fraud, tax evasion, those types of things become significantly easier because the data has all been harmonized. And the third thing I'd say is, if we wanted to take a leadership role, one of the things that I don't think our G8 partners are doing, and one of the things that makes everybody in the open data movement very, very nervous, is there's actually no protection to our access to most of this data. Or our only protection is actually to do an ATIP request. So if the country wanted to do something that was truly transformational, it would try to figure out, whenever it's passing legislation, what are the core data sets that make this legislation work? What are the core data sets that allow for the transparency so the public can assess whether the legislation is working? And so the MPRI, which is the data about pollution, is a wonderful example. And that data set is protected by legislation. Government is required to collect it. It's required to share it by law. And it is almost unique in that way. And so I would love to see, how are we building data sets that we think are critical to infrastructure or critical to accountability in this country being protected by law, so that users, whether they're corporate or just citizens, know that this data is going to be around and they can actually build infrastructure around it, and they're not taking enormous risks because the government might get uncomfortable in the future and simply pull that data back the moment it does something it doesn't like.
So cynical for someone so young.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Ablancy. Ms. Miller, did you have anything to add very quickly?
Underestimate the difficulty in integrating data sets. So David alluded to it, but the difficulty in taking two open data sets and aligning them, figuring out if two records actually refer to the same corporate entity, if the data that they represent is actually consistent with each other, if one is in metric, if one is in imperial units, it's an incredibly difficult problem. And it's one that requires today, with current technology, many human years of intervention in order to really align two data sets. So it's a very difficult problem. So my advice would be to strategically pick areas where we can see real economic benefit in aligning the data with other G8 countries.
Thank you. Merci. Maintenant pour Madame D. 5.
And now, Ms. Day, 5 minutes. Thank you. So I'd like to come back to this site. We have kind of like a table of contents on the first page, new of the code, which took place in Toronto this past weekend. I was interested in this because I believe it was Ms. Muller who talked about this. You said that our students are leaving and going to Silicon Valley. We know that Silicon Valley was built. I mean, it's not a utopia. There was nothing on the basis of there actually was the desert. And then in terms of the digital world, fabulous things have happened since in Silicon Valley. Now, also for the movie industry, whether it's in Ontario or Quebec, we know that that industry is growing. We could create a site. Alberta is beautiful. The Gaspé area is very beautiful as well. There are some places like that that we could use to bring our students to, whether it's a utopia or not. However, we could perhaps have a region that would be like Silicon Valley, the way they did that. They built it from the bottom up. Now, the University of Waterloo, will it open up, will it be part of the Open Data Institute, and will the University of Toronto do so as well? And will there be tax credits and things like that to help out our students and our researchers who are studying at the University of Toronto here in Canada?
Commencer par Madame Debenko.
Let's start with Ms. Debenko.
It's an excellent question, an excellent observation as well. It's very early stages for the ODI, the Open Data Institute. There was very definitely an inclination to do this institutionally. I think the reason that Waterloo was selected is just because of the amount of success that the Waterloo region has achieved over the past number of years in and around digital technology development and incubation of initiatives. So it's, as I said, it's early stages yet, but there's an inclination to not only share what's been developed, but to work together with other universities.
Yes, and to follow up on that, I think it's a very needed initiative to create something like this in Canada. And I think what you find, I have had students who have done startups in Toronto, and they eventually all go out to Silicon Valley because they eventually hit a wall that there's just not the culture and expertise and enough people here to draw on to sustain their endeavors. And I think we do need an initiative, as you're saying, that is cross-institutional and cross-provincial to bootstrap that process, to create the critical mass that you need to be able to sustain a culture like that.
And in your opinion, what conditions should we put in place? What needs to be there?
Well, it's the critical mass of expertise. So I think you need the significant investment of existing entrepreneurs. You need on the business side, you need on the technical side, you need on the marketing side, you need a whole holistic approach to this. That it's not just it's not just folks around students. We have incredibly bright students, but we need the infrastructure that's holistic for creating that entrepreneurial culture.
Well, excuse me for coming in. Mars has done a terrific job in Toronto, as has Communitech in Waterloo. We're working together, but what typically blocks us is the lack of venture capital to really take the initiative to the second stage of development.
Merci, Madame Day.
Thank you very much, Ms. Day. And for the answers as well, Mr. O'Connor.
The Government of Canada has identified 14 areas for data that they're supposed to produce. And I think when we talk about government, I believe we're talking about the bureaucracies, because they're the big monsters out there that make the data. And I'm a bit skeptical. For instance, one of the areas chosen is government accountability and democracy. I can't imagine any government of any stripe is going to pour data out on that, but maybe they will. My problem with all this data, and we're talking about the government because I don't think private industry provides much information in the sense that they're commercial. What compulsion can we give to a government to make them produce data? Because, as I said, there's 14 areas here, education, justice, energy, it goes on and on and on. But governments are only going to provide the data they want to provide. And I'll ask each of you in turn to answer the question. I'll start with David.
I don't disagree. And it's actually enormously difficult to get governments to provide data, especially data that might make them uncomfortable. My hope is that longer term, we could end up in a world where we have a more iterative view of government, where we're less driven by kind of what is the scandal that we can nail someone, particularly a public servant, to the wall against over a particular error, and rather end up in a place where we try to iterate around solutions, and actually spotting errors in government is seen as a good thing because it allows us to iterate and make it better, rather than the thing that drives a scandal, and particularly if it's this type of problem that's really non-strategic, but it can end up eating up everybody's time. This would be certainly the place I would love to go. The way that I think you got to go about it is, as I mentioned earlier, is I think you have to think about how you're going to draft this stuff into legislation. Because when you draft it into legislation, it forces parliamentarians and it forces the government to think about what is the data that is actually high leverage, and what is the data that will cause us to behave in ways that we want to behave, and that they'll accept a longer-term plan. And the MPRI data set, the one around pollution, I think is a wonderful example of a government that is potentially embarrassing data set, and yet now encoded in legislation, and it causes all the incentives, both in the private sector and in government, to be wonderfully aligned around how we minimize pollution. And so I think finding those types of leverage points are going to be critical. And then the other is ultimately, we do have access information legislation that should allow us to have access to this data. So if I was going to be thinking about how do we prod governments along, just tweaking the access information legislation so it says when I make a request, I'm allowed to request a data set, and you're not allowed to hand it to me in PDFs or in printed sheets. You actually have to hand me a disk or send me a file that gives me the database in a machine-readable way. At that point, I can get the data either way. Aren't you better off making it accessible to me so I don't eat up a whole bunch of time making requests over and over and over again, and actually simply reduce the burden on government? So we actually have access to the data either way. The question is, how do we make it painless, and how do we make it easier for government? So let's put it into legislation where we have to, and then let's improve access information legislation.
I'm show my stripes as the bohemian academic here, but I don't think that the stick approach always works. So as an academic, I'm required by my funding agencies to always provide any data that I come up with that's federally funded, and I have to make that available. But there's a tremendous number of scientists who feel like their data is their own, and they don't want another scientist to make a breakthrough based on the data that they spent time collecting, right? And so we find ways around that. We don't publish the stuff that we think could be valuable, right? We publish enough to satisfy the law, but we keep to ourselves the things that are going to give us that Nobel Prize. So I don't think just mandating it is enough. Rather, I think what we want is creative government employees who understand that if they need certain kinds of data and certain kinds of expertise, that publishing a data set may be a way for them to get the expertise that they don't have in-house, and maybe a way to get somebody else to solve problems that they have. And so I think we should view open data as a way of providing solutions into government, which is what I was saying about the flow back into government. Can we provide data out there that if somebody did something with, I, as a government employee, could benefit from that and improve my processes. And if we can get governments to start thinking that way, I think we'll get better data out there.
Merci. Je vais devoir laisser 30.
Thank you. I'll give Ms. Dibenko and Mr. Gaylor 5 seconds, 30 seconds each.
En commençant par Madame Dibenko.
Ms. Dibenko first.
I love the carrot and the stick idea, and I think in general carrots work way better. So there has to be incentives, and the thing that leapt to my mind is efficiencies. So if indeed the individual government department can actually see utilizing that data to drive efficiencies that are required because of reduced funding to their organizations, that would be ideal. And then ultimately to look for fraud and theft and other kinds of things that are going awry within their departments.
Yeah, I think I'd build on earlier comments. I think this is about reducing friction. Many governments around the world build their open data policies on the freedom of information legislation or access to information legislation that they have in place. And I think this issue is really about reducing friction and making access more available. If you can make the data, if you can publish it, make it available easily and consumable, then you should do that and not hide it behind, a lot of bureaucracy that may be unnecessary in a particular case. That's not necessarily always the case, of course, but I think reduce friction where you can, and that encourages people to publish, it encourages citizens to consume. The other thing I would say to finish is that it's important to understand that open data is not WikiLeaks. These are separate things, so I think it's important to make that distinction as well.
Merci. Donc, on passe à Monsieur Blanchette.
Thank you. Mr. Blanchette, 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. This time, I'm going to ask my question of Mr. Eves. During your presentation, you stated that at the heart of all of this was what Mr. Gaylor called organizational culture. We're not creating data just to create data, especially at the government level, because otherwise we'd be told we're wasting taxpayer money. But it's a way of approaching the work. It's an approach. Do you have any experience in terms of organizational culture and how to change it? What are the trends? How can we proceed to ensure that, for example, at the federal government, we could progressively develop this culture where data is shared? And I'm not talking about privacy and personal data, of course, because that's very important. But how can we put in place a culture where data is shared? We already mentioned that often there are silos between departments, between you and me. What we see in the public administration is the same thing that happens in the private sector. If in large companies, there are definitely silos. What do you have to say about that?
I agree with the carrot and the stick. I'm a big fan of carrots, and I've used them with this government. But I'm also a believer in sticks. So the question is, how do you manage both? And the question of culture is enormously important. It doesn't actually matter how many rules you have in place. what I'm most interested in how you create incentives for public servants to want to share more. And I think there's a couple of things that we have at our disposal on how to make that happen. The first is, I don't think that most public servants have grown up in an era where ministerial orders or deputy ministerial orders have been, don't share anything because there's only risk that's involved in sharing. And I think, how do we begin to crack that? How do we begin to change that culture? And the first one is there are lots of examples around how transparency can move policy, it can advance a policy agenda. My most favorite example, and the one I always give in talks, is around food restaurant inspection data. So it turns out in LA, they decided they were going to publish restaurant inspection results on the front doors of restaurants. And the moment they started doing that, you had more people going to restaurants that had better results and fewer people going to restaurants that had worse results. And wouldn't you know it, but it turns out that as a result, you also had fewer people ending up in the emergency room with foodborne-related illnesses, which is the most expensive point of contact in the healthcare system. So if you want to drive a policy outcome of reducing healthcare costs, it turns out publishing restaurant inspection results in a useful manner is a great way of driving that. So we actually have a whole bunch of examples where transparency and sharing data actually advances policy agendas. And so driving those stories through the public service and causing public servants to think about where is transparency actually strategically in your interests would, I think, cause people to begin to reevaluate why they should be sharing. And then if we can get them to be thinking about that, we might begin to crack the door open a little bit more where they go, actually, the risks of sharing this other information don't quite feel as high as they did before. And now I see that there are actually benefits in these policy areas where sharing created these outcomes that I liked. So that's probably the direction I try to go.
Okay.
All right. There's all of that, of course, but at the same time, you use this stick example with the restaurant, with your example of the restaurant. You mentioned you had 4 points earlier, and if I were to summarize them, 2 to 4, I would say that it's the difficulty public administrations faced in using all of the data they have at their disposal. What you're saying now is that perhaps people could help with that aspect. We could push things a little bit further. Perhaps sharing that data could help the government to meet its own goals, because human curiosity can really lead to all kinds of diversity. We see that at the economic level, of course. The government, federal, and all governments have economic responsibilities, of course, but also other duties. So all of government could benefit from that.
The product recall data, so the federal government has an app on product recall data, which strikes me as a great example. So for me, if you look at the data that underlies that app, only some of it's available in the open data portal. But you have to be the most OCD person in the world to fire up an app to check whether or not a product has been recalled before you buy it. But if you made the data available, there's kind of a long tail of users. There's people who have dairy allergies. There's people who have wheat allergies. There's people who have kids. They're not all going to go to this app. You try to aggregate all of those users into one app, and they're not going to use it. But if you had actually had the data available, organizations and associations that represent those people or that serve those people might grab that data and provide it to them in the places where they actually look and they actually read. And you'd actually end up having a much higher policy impact around that data set than having the government create an app.
Thank you, Mr. Eves. Now to Madame Brown for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chair. And just to the witnesses, I'm only a visitor to this committee today, filling in for one of my colleagues. But I find this discussion really, really exciting. And my word, it's phenomenal where it can go. Mr. Banco, I had the opportunity to visit Computech in Waterloo, and I visited the Mars building in Toronto, and so I have been exposed to some of this. I don't consider myself any sort of a technical wizard by any stretch of the imagination, but this absolutely fascinates me. Mr. Banco, in your opening comments, you talked about this being our next natural resource. Canada is incredibly blessed with natural resources. If this is our next natural resource, what kind of transformation is this going to have for our economy? We know that when we started building cars, we stopped building horses and buggies. Well, we still have horses, but we stopped building the buggies. So the opportunities are there. You talked about the challenges with getting venture capital. What incentives can we put in place to help venture capitalists become engaged? And Mr. Gaylor, maybe you've got some comments from the perspective of Microsoft, because I'm sure you've got a long history of looking at how new technologies come on board, and how do you aggregate that into the business? Could you both comment on those?
Maybe I'll just start off by talking about what I think is really necessary for the transformation of this opportunity for Canada, and that is around our young people. So it's really a matter, I believe, of doing the best that we can to produce the knowledge worker of the future. And by that I mean not necessarily just engineers or just computer scientists, just mathematicians, but also bringing in arts and bringing in an understanding of the humanities and social sciences as well, to really create individuals that are, I guess, fluent and creative on all levels. And only by doing that, I think, that are we going to create the natural cycle. So once you have and Renee spoke very compellingly about this, we have so many bright young people in Canada. So the ideas are not the issue. They truly are not. But if we can prove, as we have in the Waterloo area, that with the kind of universities that we have there and colleges, that we have a huge labor force that is being created in that region, then I think the rest will come. Venture capitalists are already from Silicon Valley turning their eyes to Canada. Unfortunately, what they do now is they attract the young people to come down, my son amongst them, I should say, to work in California. But over time, if we're able to prime the pump enough, my belief is that we can create our own ecosystem here in Canada. Mark?
Yeah, I think I would totally agree with that, and I think there are already examples where we've seen transformational things being done with government data that's being used by commercial entities. One of the examples that David will be very familiar with back in the early days of the City of Vancouver Open Data was a local firm of architects here used some open data to predict water levels and the impact that would have on the local downtown area in Vancouver. And the comment that I loved about that, it wasn't that we couldn't get access to this data before as a commercial entity. It was we didn't know who to talk to, we didn't know how to get this data. It was just too difficult. So the fact that the data was published enabled us to do something new and innovative with that information that helps our business and ultimately benefits our customers. So I think this is a very simple example of how this data can be used in partnership with commercial organizations. Of course, data's been commercialized for years. This is nothing new. There are whole industries built on it. Advertising, marketing, demographic data, retail analysis data, and organizations around that. So this is something that the commercial industry is very familiar with, and makes money with, in different ways. I think the key here is to establish the partnerships between the government data sources and those third-party commercial sources, because once you start combining the data in this way, transformative things start to happen. Let me give you another example, again from Vancouver. When Vancouver shared parking data initially, it shared parking data around the use of city-owned meters. It didn't have the commercial parking data because it didn't own that data, so it didn't publish it that. The commercial parking companies weren't publishing their data because they were effectively in competition with each other and the city. So it actually took a third-party developer, an independent developer, to actually take the published City of Vancouver data and that commercial data and combine them. This is something that naturally neither the city nor the parking entity would do off their own bat. It took a third-party independent developer to do that. So I think this is the value that these partnerships, by sharing the data in the first place, you can create these chains of reaction, and the more partnerships you bring to bear on this, the more valuable the data gets.
Merci.
The last thing I would say is, sorry, just one more point. We have got an ocean of data coming down the line. If you guys think the data that we're sitting on today is it is not. Even the data that the government alone is going to produce is nothing compared to what we call big data, which is the wealth of research, scientific, commercial data that's coming down the line. And so the potential for combining that and creating even more economic value is absolutely huge.
Merci, thank you. Alors, Monsieur Byrne, maintenant pour 5 minutes également.
Mr. Chair. I was interested to hear, Mr. Eves, your comment. One of the objectives, I guess, of this study would be to assist the government in moving the initiative along. You had mentioned that there was one practice which you found contrary to the spirit and the G8 commitment that Canada was making with Industry Canada. Are there any other circumstances or practices that you may be aware of that you could share with the committee that where you sort of question or want to raise whether or not the government of Canada is running contrary to the G8 charter or to the spirit, generally speaking, of what an open data portal, what an open government is supposed to be about?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are numerous examples, and I don't say this to pick on this particular government. I think, as previously said, all governments get cautious around sharing data and information, and one of the reasons we have a competitive political process is to keep people honest. 2 points I'd love to make. So one is I think there are all sorts of macro examples. For example, during like the people were curious about the F-35 spending. The Parliament demanded documents, and then those documents were produced like in 100 boxes and printed out. And what this meant is that if you were someone who was actually interested in learning anything about this, you couldn't do keyword searches of that. You'd actually have to go through and read every single piece of paper. This is what we call hiding things by making them available, but in formats that are completely useless or very, very hard to use. And I think those types of behaviors are examples of a government where they're not actually interested in transparency, and they're certainly not actually interested in sharing information. And so I'd be looking for ways that we could curtail governments from doing that in the future. So when I ask for a document, I get it in a machine-readable way so I can do keyword searches and go and find the interesting things. And I'd love to see more. I'd love to see more around actual budget data being made available for download so that people can actually, how do we make the government more legible to the population so they can see where money's getting spent and they can see, how their tax dollars are being used. And I think we actually have a long way. I think all governments have a long way, but we in particular have a long way to go. And the UK is actually a very interesting example around this. They've made all spending data down to £500, downloadable and publicly available. And so you can actually go and see how each department is spending its money. And this has been interesting to the public, but I think it's actually been very, very interesting to even people in government, because they actually now can access how the money is being spent in a very direct way. Their staff can, and they can do their own analysis. And so I think even government officials, elected officials, have found this data set to be very, very interesting. And another example would be the access information request. I see no reason why, when someone makes an access information request, why is that document not being put in a publicly available database so that if I now want to do the same access information request, I'm not going through the whole thing all over again. I can actually go scan the ones that have already been done, and you can save me a whole bunch of time, but more importantly, you can save government and taxpayers a whole bunch of time by not having people running around and gathering up the same documents and doing the same assessment all over again. I think it's in everybody's interest to make that happen. So those are kind of cumulatively the things that I would say. At a high level, a recommendation you can make, one of the recommendations we made in Ontario with the Open Government Task Force was actually creating rules around procurement. So you say any system that is bought by this government that is going to produce data must have in its procurement demands as part of the specs the ability to extract that data easily. So that, when you go and make it, if someone comes along and asks for something, there's no longer this question, oh, well, the system's old or it's hard to use or we can't extract it. We've actually built that in as a requirement so we make it easy to extract the information. So I actually feel changing procurement rules is one of the most powerful tools that you have at your disposal to thinking about how we can make data more accessible to people.
On that specific subject, would you be able to expand upon that through a letter to the chair of the committee?
Yeah.
Because I think that's something that unfortunately 30 seconds is not going to cover well.
Agreed.
And also in that same vein, if there are other specific items that you really want to highlight to the committee, and I'm saying this to all the witnesses, if there are any other specific items that you may wish to highlight to the committee, you would have an opportunity. I'm sure the chair would agree to be able to write a letter to the chair and that would be considered, I'm sure, as by the committee as to be part of the witness testimony. So for the purposes of our report writing, I think you'll get a consensus on that. So could I then just share the floor then with some of the other witnesses, Mr. Chair?
Oui, c'est
Yes. Do any of the witnesses want to add anything? Also, I'd like to remind you that you can always submit additional information through the clerk, documents, for example, if you would like. Documents pertaining to our study for consideration by committee members. Does anybody want to add anything? Okay. So let's move to Mr. O'Connor.
Comments? Is that your question?
Non, c'était savoir si vous...
No, it was just to respond to Mr. Burns if there was anything you wanted to add pertaining to his question. But at the end, I can give you a few minutes to add a few words. Okay, Mr. O'Connor.
For 40 or 50 years, technology has continued to generate machines that provide more and more information to people. And if I think back 3,000 years ago in Greece, in Athens, they had the Acropolis, and all the citizens would arrive in the Acropolis and discuss issues and pass judgment, etc. But as populations got bigger and more organized, we went into silos and categories, etc. And so nowadays we have trillions and trillions of pieces of information which citizens can't get at. Now, I'm looking at the trend lines of what's going on here, and it seems to me that with open data, if open data actually becomes open data throughout this country and other countries, we'll be moving back towards the Acropolis again, which will affect governments, the organizations of governments, etc. And I just wonder, in your final thoughts, whether you have any opinions on how open data is going to affect governments. And I'd start with Ms. Miller and run the other way. Okay.
Sounds good. Yes, I think open data is going to lead to an open government revolution. So I think it has the potential of making governments more participatory and down to to a much finer grain than we have right now. So, and I think this is my call to ensure, even at the beginning of the open data revolution, that we make channels for flow of that information back into the institutions, because I think we can make better decisions based on data. And I think we're seeing that revolution in education. We're seeing data-driven education. We're seeing data-driven medicine. And we're going to see data-driven governments, where we're using past practices, best practices, in order to bring that back into government. So I think it's an exciting opportunity.
Ms. DeBanco?
I would just like to point once again to engagement. I think lack of engagement of the citizenry is really the biggest challenge that government faces today, and I would see open data as a very useful tool to not only speak to the electorate, but also to get opinion from them, and in doing so, get them involved in government affairs.
Mr. Gaylor.
Yeah, I think this is a very important point. You know, back to my point the point that I made earlier, that the amount of data is only going to increase. So I think where government can help is by providing easy access to that data based on the way that consumers and citizens want to access it. You know, don't force them to go to a particular portal. Don't force them to go to a particular, to use a particular type of technology to access that data. Give them the data in a way that's open, it's a service, they can consume it the way they want to. Secondly, I want to just give you two more examples about how transformative open data combined with this sheer growth in the amount of data really can be. So the first one is with the city of Barcelona, where they have a program where they share bikes across the city. They provide bikes that can be taken from one transit stop to another. So the city publishes data on the availability of these bicycles, which obviously fluctuates depending on time of day and also if they're having events or not. So what the city did is they combined that data with social media data, and by tracking sentiment on social media through Twitter and Facebook and stuff like that, they're getting instant dynamic feedback about how the citizenry is regarding the availability of these bikes. Are there enough bikes in a particular area? Are the bikes of good quality? So what you can see here now is government combining their data with a huge volume of big data that's out there and growing and growing and growing every day, and providing this to improve decision-making to the point that I think Ms. Miller made earlier on. And I think this is where we see this going, with the increase in data, the increase in the ubiquitousness of technology, engaging consumers and crowdsourcing to enable government to engage and make better decision-making.
Mr. Eves.
You guys actually have a much bigger responsibility than I think people are let on. I'll maybe share that more in closing, but one of the things that I love is, as an illustration of that, is I love Clay Christensen, a famous author, business school, Harvard Business School professor. He says, when you destroy the value in one part of the value chain, it migrates to another. So, you know, if you make software free, the value doesn't disappear. The value shifts over to the services. Now, servicing the software is where the money's going to be located. I think there's something similar around politics. You know, when you knock the politics out of one part of the political chain, you don't destroy the politics, it just migrates to a different part. And this is one place around data where you have an enormous responsibility. It used to be, you know, in a world of open data where you can presume that information or data that government's creating is going to be made public, that used to be a political decision. It used to be a decision that a minister could say, I'm going to share this data or I'm not going to share this data. If we now presume that all data is going to be made public, we've now taken the politics out of that part of the chain. But that means the politics doesn't disappear. It moves to a different part of the chain. And so one of the questions I think politicians are going to increasingly be asking themselves is they say, well, if the data gets created, if that means it's going to be shared, I'm going to have a lot more scrutiny over what data is going to get created in the first place. Some people would argue this is what happened around the long-form census, that we actually didn't want to have the data created in the first place because that meant that there would be questions asked that government didn't want to be asked, or policies pursued that people didn't want to get pursued. The data is going to become more political the more open it becomes. And so this committee needs to think about what the ramifications of that are. And I would follow it on to say, I would be very careful to presume that data is going to lead to better decision making. Now, having data-driven decisions does not mean a better decision. I only need to show you a map of a congressional district in Chicago that looks like a tiny little filament that's kind of running through 9 different neighborhoods that makes absolutely zero sense. But the reason that congressional district was created was to produce a very specific outcome. And that was a data-driven outcome. I want to be clear. You could never create that congressional district unless you had phenomenal data about who was living in what types of neighborhoods and who you thought those people were and how they were going to vote. That was a data-driven decision. And we could argue about whether it was a better decision or not. It was a better decision if you were trying to create the outcome that that decision created. So we're not about to depoliticize any of this, and we're not about to end all this. You guys have an enormous responsibility to be thinking about what the politics of data are, and even if you're just talking about economic data. And I don't want you to lose sight of that.
Thank you, Mr. Eves. Pour terminer, Mr. Blanchette.
Thank you, and let's end with Mr. Blanchette. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. O'Connor's approach is very interesting, and Mr. Eves' response is very interesting as well, because it opens up a new field of questions, which is what kind of guidelines and what kind of framework we want to provide for sharing data. Mr. Eves, I understand that you want all data to be shared, of course, but there are some realities that we can't set aside. Ms. Miller talked about intellectual property rights. That needs to be protected. Now, in terms of businesses, it is difficult for businesses to share data that would show their weaknesses compared to their opponents or their competition. And we can understand that as well. The question, therefore, could be, if the government decides to share more data in the future, what would the framework and the important framework be to put in place for organizations such as governments and large corporations to protect privacy, to have data? Now, could I get a brief comment on that from each of you?
Thank you. So I agree. I think there are criteria that we need to be worried about. So the first would be making sure we're not releasing data that has personal information in it, or at least not releasing data that has personal information that we don't want to be releasing. So I'm quite happy to release who are the directors of companies, but I certainly don't think that the government should have a role in releasing my personal healthcare data. So that would be one. Around IP, intellectual property, I get that that is a concern, although my personal feeling is that if something is government funded, it actually, tax dollars went to create that. It is already a public asset, and by assigning the IP to a private company, we're actually doing a disservice to Canadians. So I'm not so concerned about the IP element of this, but I'll leave it at those two because I want to make sure everybody else has a chance to share something.
Yeah, so in terms of privacy, I think it's important to note that privacy is not just about releasing individual data, so releasing the name of somebody and their medical status, but aggregate data actually can also release personal information. So it's important that statisticians and so forth are very careful that the aggregate data, that you can't learn information about individuals from aggregate data. And there's well-known cases of this where you can infer information about a public figure's medical records from the release of aggregate data. So I think that's incredibly important in terms of privacy and what we release. In terms of IP, I think there are very good open licenses out there. Just like we have open licenses for software, there's open licenses for data that retains the IP on the information and lets it be used for the public good. And I think those licenses, they're evolving still, but there's a good trend in those licenses that lets you release your data while still maintaining ownership over that data. And it's also an important point.
Madame Dibenko.
Ms. Dibenko.
Obviously, privacy issues are huge with regard to big data, never mind just open data. I've often felt that you need almost a Magna Carta along with big data, and that would include notice that predictions based on big data had taken place and what's been predicted and how. An opportunity for feedback or a hearing, if you like, if the individual has an issue with that. And then finally, audit trails that will that records the basis of predictive decisions. So I think that although not all open data is obviously personally attributable, that there is a need to consider those three basic tenets, if you like, across big data as well.
I think my colleagues have said it very well. We have to be careful, obviously, about sharing the open data with personal private information. By and large, that does not happen except in specific circumstances. But there is data that can be shared that would historically or traditionally be considered sensitive that has tremendous value, and I'd like to give you a very quick example of that. Particularly around health data and crime data, for example. The citizens are very interested in crime data. Where is crime occurring? How frequently is it occurring? You share the data in terms of trending and statistical data. You don't obviously give intimate details around who committed the crime or what victim was who was a victim of the crime. And a real benefit of this has happened recently in the UK, where in one of the cities they analyzed the influx of patients in the city hospitals over a weekend. They combined that with violent crime in the area around bars and restaurants in that city. And between these different agencies, the hospital, the police, and bars and restaurants, they took a collective decision to start serving plastic glasses in bars and restaurants, because they realized that I think it was up to 40% of the emergency cases in the hospital was caused by fights and violent activities occurring around bars and restaurants. So here's a great example where you're sharing data in a way that's it's not sharing personal private information, it's anonymized data, but it enables a decision to be made that probably wouldn't have happened had that data not been shared in the first place, and particularly shared amongst different government agencies.
Merci pour vos réponses.
Thank you very much for your answers. We have a few minutes left. I don't know if any of you had anything to add as closing words. This would be the time. If you have anything to add, we can start with Mr. Eves.
I would say I hope that I have impressed on this committee the responsibility that it has when thinking about this issue. That it's not just a lot of people are going to come before you and talk about the huge opportunity and the money and this stuff matters. I want you to be thinking holistically about this, not just about software, but about analysis and about how we can be using this to change the way government works and increasing the productivity and effectiveness of government, and also about the responsibility around the politics of data, and that you can't escape that and that you need to be thinking about that. And I think I'd just say the final thing is that I am here at the disposal of this committee. You should feel free to call upon me anytime, and if you want information or ideas, you should be more than welcome to write me an email in French or in English, and I will respond as quickly as I possibly can to get you the best possible information to inform your decisions.
Merci. Madame Miller, quelque chose à rajouter?
Thank you. Ms. Miller, anything to add?
Very much for the opportunity to testify on this panel. I think it is a very important issue. I'll reiterate that. And I think you are going to be amazed at the kinds of things that Canadians can do with your data. And we have a lot of creativity out there in the community, and I think you'll have some wonderful surprises in the future on great things. So,
Monsieur Gaylor, quelque chose à rajouter?
Mr. Gaylor, anything to add?
Yes, I would just like to say thank you very much for inviting me to participate. Obviously, this is the area that I specialize in is technology, so if I can be of assistance to the committee or the committee members around technology issues, I'd be very happy to do that. In closing, I would just like to say I think it's a tremendous opportunity. We have a long way to go in the world with open data, the way it's being published, the way it's being consumed, and how transformational it can be. And I think Canada has a wonderful opportunity to be a lead, even more of a leader in this area, and so I'm looking forward to what happens next.
Madame Debenko, le mot de la fin.
Ms. Debenko, the last word.
And like the others, thanks so much for including me in this discussion. As I had said previously, I think that although there will be huge challenges associated with grappling with the obvious benefits that could come out of open data, I strongly believe that one of the most important benefits will be engagement of a populace, particularly a younger demographic, that today feel very disconnected from government processes. So thank you again very much.
Alors, merci à tous. Merci aux membres.
Thank you to all of you and to the members of the committee. Thank you, Ms. Miller, Mr. Eves, Ms. Debenko, and Mr. Giller. For your time, especially for those of you who are used to Vancouver time. I'm sure the committee will be able to use your expertise and for the rest of its study. And the meeting is adjourned, and we will reconvene next Tuesday.